Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that, yes, even in the midst of a pandemic, make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. The legislature is back in session after its first unscheduled recess in nearly 160 years. And some lawmakers have returned from being sequestered in the districts for a couple of months, tending to their communities and dealing at a distance with governing during a pandemic. But it is decidedly not business as usual here in Sacramento, or anywhere else in the state, really. The human and fiscal damage to California has been devastating, eviscerating families and businesses, driving up job losses, and now the legislature and the governor have the initially unimaginable, but now not unexpected challenge of confronting a pandemic state budget deficit of billions of dollars and dealing with far different and far more sobering financial and policy goals than they were considering even 3 months ago. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll talk with one of our legislature's chief state budget leaders about how lawmakers will approach the looming state budget deficit, how they'll guide the rest of us through a shaky and not always friendly transition to a time of health, economic, social, and cultural semi-normalcy. We'll glance further at the gaping health and justice chasms that affect communities of color and those persons without a secure safety net around them and that threaten to swallow more and more of us. And hear more seasoned perspective about what should be, must be, the catalyst for a political, social, and human transformation that California can lead the way in securing. We're always proud to welcome back to this podcast State Senator Holly Mitchell, who represents the 30th Senate District in the heart of Los Angeles. Senator Mitchell has spent the last decade as a member of the legislature, first as an assembly member and then a senator, and she promotes equity and justice not only in California policy but also in fiscal priorities as the chair of the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. Senator Mitchell is accurately described as the legislature's moral compass, and we will take that hopeful title and make it our collective gospel and be thankful, especially now, that she is our public servant. Senator Mitchell is back at work here in Sacramento, and we are here in her office in this conference room at this long conference table practicing social distancing so we can talk in person. Senator Mitchell, welcome back to Then There's California.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure always to share time with you, and I enjoyed my initial experience on your podcast.
You were my first guest host, my first guest.
That. Yes, we've had fun.
We have. I'm always glad to have you back, and it is good to see you, literally, to see you in person.
Same here.
How you been?
I'm fine. My family and I are healthy. We followed the governor and my mayor's orders, and we stayed safe at home, which was the logo in Los Angeles.
Right.
And while staying safe at home, there was a lot of hard work being done at home. As Senate Budget Committee Chair, by virtue of that appointment, I'm also chair of the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. And so a lot of work took place during these last 8 weeks, making sure that we were reviewing and approving and concurring with all of the allocations the governor was making to basically fund his executive orders. And so it's been a busy, busy time.
Yes, and has it not been really one of the most surreal times in your life and in your career? Elaborate on that.
We are living in the middle of a public health, economic pandemic of a magnitude that most living Californians have never experienced. You know, we've read about the Spanish flu. There's a wonderful TV commercial on that's focusing on women giving birth during this time. And there's a woman who was born during the Spanish flu. And so she talks about you'll make it through and the kind of supports and the way the community supported her mother. And so it was a wonderful message, but it reminded me that there aren't many people living who've experienced anything like this.
I mentioned to a friend yesterday that I was going to do this episode with you today and told her the topics we were going to discuss, and she said, wow, are you going to make Holly Mitchell change the world in one podcast? So no pressure.
Thank you. And thank your friend for me.
Yes. Well, looking at the last couple of months and things going on in your district, I've done a few podcasts with a couple of your colleagues by phone from their districts. And the interesting dynamic of literally watching their jobs as legislators transform before their eyes, to some degree redefining what they are doing as legislators and as lawmakers. Is that what's happened to you? I mean, in addition to dealing with the emergency orders from the governor and approving all of that, just the boots on the ground kind of work that's going on in your district. Talk about that dynamic that you have dealt with along with your other colleagues.
That's interesting, because I don't see my job as different. You know, I come to this from a community-based orientation, having worked and led community-based organizations. And, you know, my history, I was a field deputy very early in my career to a member, former State Senator Diane Watson, who believed in boots on the streets all the time. That's how you best served your constituents. And so it's funny, I don't see my role as different. My district office staff are doing a phenomenal job fielding those calls and questions every day. People who need help navigating various state departments, primarily the Employment Development Department. It was very important to me as we were designing our how to work remotely that my phones be answered. I didn't want people to go to a voicemail and have to wait for a callback. I wanted my phones answered by a live person in real time.
And that's reassuring. And even if it's just a simple call of where can I get toilet paper, they can talk to a human voice in your office and get help, if not direct answers.
Absolutely. My team switched gears immediately and put together the most amazing resource link on my state website. I think we were one of the first Senate offices to make that available in Spanish also. And so we had our mind on who our constituents are, who would need our help, and have done all that we can to provide it to them. I'm also clear that while you, in the middle of an emergency, you focus on boots on the streets, but I also am always cognizant that I'm a policymaker. And so what helps my constituents most is that I stay in my lane as a state policymaker and do what I can to make sure resources are available, that the state departments have the resources they need to deliver the direct service. And so I'm also mindful and have spent up quite a bit of time in that area as well.
Now, when you talk about staying in your lane, it makes me think, am I being presumptuous in saying that this pandemic has perhaps made glaringly clearer maybe the limitations of your power and agency in the state?
Good question. No, I think that we have stepped up in a meaningful way in supporting the governor, who has used his executive order liberally, appropriately, to manage a pandemic of this magnitude. I felt it was important for us to make sure that EDD was resourced, to augment its staff by thousands, to expand their phone lines, to make sure that government, state government, was working efficiently and effectively. And that's what I was elected to do, and I felt empowered to do so.
The greater Los Angeles area has been deeply, heartbreakingly affected and impacted by this coronavirus. Tell us about what's going on specifically in the 30th Senate District. And I know L.A. is a big, expansive place, and there are no boundaries of districts, but the folks that you deal with, the constituents that you talk to, tell us the stories of your constituents and what's going on down there.
It is absolutely overwhelming, and I think my mantra to myself every morning when I wake up is not to allow myself to become immobilized by a sense of overwhelm, but just to try to solve one problem at a time. To think of a county of 10 million people, 50% of whom are not working as a direct result of COVID. To think of a school district the size of LAUSD to have to close, and the sheer number of children who have no internet, have no Chromebook, didn't have reliable access to healthy meals or snacks every day, who may not be safe at home, and I think we've begun to use that term so liberally, safe at home, and there are people who aren't safe at home. When I think about the children in the Child Welfare Services system in LA County who need intervention immediately for them to be safe, who are having to engage with social workers via video and Zoom, and for teenagers that may be great, but not little ones. When I think of the women who are victims of domestic violence, when I think about the 60,000 plus unhoused family, friends, and neighbors who call LA County home, and how you can attempt to shelter in place or wash your hands frequently when there are no reliable hand washing stations with soap. When I think about all of those who are living in congregate settings, from nursing homes to juvenile hall to probation camps to county jail to skilled nursing facilities to board and care facilities.
Absolutely.
It's very, very frightening. And I think we as policymakers are doing all that we can as quickly as we can to address those issues, but it feels a little like little fires popping up, and you're just trying to be strategic and develop policy and yet dealing with emergencies in real time.
Emergencies, challenges, disparities that were present before all of this and now are doubly magnified.
Without question, there is a infamous and famous community leader in South LA, Sweet Alice Harris, and she's the founder of an organization, Parents of Watts. And Sweet Alice has said for years that when the rest of the world catches a cold, the families in Watts get pneumonia.
Wow,
and
that's
that is
right.
so poignant when you recognize that people who are already compromised in terms of their health, their lung capacity, people who are already compromised in terms of the fragility of their economic situation, the fragility of their employment status, the fragility of their access to health care services. This pandemic has amplified and showed the world the huge fissures in our social service delivery system and in society as a whole. And so those who are already living on the margins simply fell off the cliff faster than anybody else.
I was going to address this later on in the podcast, but let's talk more about this now. As you say, the coronavirus, it's brought misery to the doorsteps of millions of Americans of all backgrounds, but it is not an equalizer. It is not a unifier. And the virus is just sweeping through and wiping out these generations of African American and Latino families in contrast to the other communities. Communities of color, and this kind of goes to what you're saying, are still so unrepresented in so many categories of opportunity and success, but they are overrepresented when it comes to the stats on this virus.
Absolutely. The African American community, the Latinx community, the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation was 170 residents. And again, it's based on living in poverty. You can't be safe at home when you have to travel 100 miles to get water and food. And so the shame of this all will be if once the first phase of the pandemic ends and we continue to fixate selfishly on one's ability to go eat out at a restaurant or just do what you want to do, contrary to what government and public health officials opine, and deny the transmission rate. And the true crime from my perspective will be as if we attempt to return back to a normal that already ostracized and left so many people behind. And so, it's not about recovery. It's about redesign and restructure. And so we have a more equitable system truly for all.
And I definitely want to touch on that before we wrap up here in a further way. Some states are releasing racial data on the infection and death rates of African American communities in particular. Some are not, and I don't know if California has been effective on that. Maybe you can comment. But there has not even been a whisper about those stats from the federal government. Do you support more of that data coming out?
Without question. I just left Senate Health Committee and was able to vote on a bill carried by Senator Weiner that talked about the importance of data collection of the LGBTQ community. As a health advocate, most of my professional career, data collection was always something we harped on. Desegregated data by race, by gender, by age. So and every public health official will tell you its importance. I think the tragedy is it's not sexy, and it's the first thing perhaps that we don't fund. During this recent pandemic, we've come to know that there are counties who, after the fact, try to go back and collect the data on the deceased, and even are collected in just antiquated, arcane kind of ways, Excel spreadsheets or by hand. And so hopefully, again, what we'll learn is the value of data through this, and make sure that that public health departments at the county level and at the state level are adequately resourced to be able to disaggregate, collect, and analyze that really important public health information.
And as you say, it even really goes deeper. The health outcomes of these communities are fragile at best already. Mm-hmm. Many distrust the medical community and won't seek medical care because they don't trust that they're going to get good medical care, so they don't go to the doctor. And so then are we surprised that these statistics are what they are?
And, I think I would move beyond. I've not met many people who didn't trust the health system. Certainly not a health system that was designed with them in mind, where they could go in their own community to a practitioner who they have the opportunity to establish relationship with over time, or that it's a practitioner who looks like them, or it's a practitioner who honors them by speaking their language. So that's, I think, needs to be our focus, making sure that it's culturally, linguistically, geographically appropriate care, because when you build it in terms of healthcare delivery system, people will come.
And let me tee off on this with this discussion. In the middle of all of this disparity, still our country aches and lurches over stories of young black men being gunned down in public while jogging. In the midst of the surreal thing that we're all dealing with, this common tragedy is still unfolding, as we've heard about in the streets of Georgia.
Or the young black woman who was gunned down in her own home in March, with law enforcement presenting, arguably not announcing their entry, and just entered the home. And then she was shot 8 times. So even a public health economic pandemic of this magnitude doesn't erase bias, implicit and explicit, or racism. It just doesn't. And so, yes, as a black woman in this country, the mother of a black son, I don't have the luxury of negating that those realities still persist, because we're now focused on something called COVID-19. It's all of that and more.
Absolutely. Moving to the legislative process here, many of you are back in Sacramento now. Committee hearings going on. Public still not able to access directly the Capitol like they used to. Limited staff. Many of your colleagues are joining online by Zoom. Mm-hmm. But since the legislature recessed in March, Governor Newsom has been the face and the body and the soul, mm-hmm. at least publicly, of the California government's COVID-19 response. In coming back, was there a feeling that you wanted to get back, get on top of this, assert yourselves again as a legislative body, because you are the direct line to the constituents and the voters? And constitutionally, it can't be a government of one, but I imagine it also to some degree is cathartic to come back here and assert yourselves as a legislative body in the process.
I think there are members who felt that. I happen to not be one of them, quite frankly.
Okay.
As chair of JLBC, I was continuing to be engaged, and all of us who were at home managing constituent services, that is, our primary function. This is representative government. And so we should continue to play a role as a conduit between our constituents and access to state services. And so that is where we needed to be at this point in our state's history. The governor, as the representative of the executive branch, stepped up. We empowered him to do so through actions we took before we recessed March 16. We passed budget bills appropriating up to $1 billion to be allocated for COVID-19 related relief. And so we did our part and he's done his. We also are playing the role of oversight, which is one of our primary functions. So through the JLBC, we've provided oversight. I chaired a hearing I guess about a month ago, of a new subcommittee that the Pro Tem appointed, Sub 6 COVID-19 response. Mm-hmm. She's appointed 2 other committees, the COVID Recovery Committee that's being co-chaired by Senators Hertzberg and Bradford, and a COVID Response Committee chaired by Senator Gonzalez. So we were involved. The governor also appointed a legislative coordinating committee with members from both the Assembly and the Senate, and we've been participating via Zoom for maybe 2 weeks now, hearing updates directly from him and his staff at the Office of Emergency Services. And so I think we've been engaged. Our leaders deemed it was appropriate and safe for us to return now under these circumstances, to continue on with the people's work, with our legislative agenda. The governor will release the May revise. That gives us 30 days to do the people's work and pass a balanced, on-time budget by June 15.
Let's talk about that.
Let's.
It's old news by now that the strong, robust state budget that you all got in January is now its own pandemic of sorts. The climate and the canvas of everything has changed. The economy has been battered badly in just the 3 months' time since the COVID-19 crisis hit us. $54 billion plus and change deficit projected and predicted by the Legislative Analyst's Office, and we're expecting to see the deficits in the out years, too.
The $54 billion was projected by Department of Finance.
Okay.
The Ledge Analysts in their spring finance outlook projected a deficit, a range between 18 and 31 billion. And so there's a stark difference between what finance has released and the LAO.
I see. So the devil's in the details, so to speak, between those two figures.
Yes.
Well, luckily we had a rainy day reserve. That saved us. But
Absolutely.
It's a deficit that's far deeper than what we had in the reserve. So you are chair of the Senate Budget Committee. You are on top of this. Tell us the next steps. What is going on as we move forward to our budget deadlines in June?
I appreciate that. We'll gavel down for our first oversight hearing to hear from finance what's in the May revised, because the reality is this will be a new budget. That's the signals we're getting loud and clear from the governor directly, as well as finance leadership. And so we'll have them present so we can begin to wrap our arms around how they arrived at this deficit figure, what factors, what projections went into arriving at that number, and we'll begin our work. The Senate Dems announced this week something we do every year where we really kind of talk about our view of the architecture of the budget and what our core values are leading into this discussion. And we announced two things: that we are relieved that we do have a healthy reserve, the largest in history. We are relieved that we spent the last 10 years being strategic in our reinvestment and in our savings. And in that time, our credit rating has recovered. We were able to pay back old loans and debts and pay forward a little bit in terms of our pension liability. So we positioned ourselves for the inevitable rainy day, what we're all told we should do.
And interestingly enough, because you were here a decade ago, you remember the recession of the previous time and all of the budget cutting. And I know you have felt deeply the process of trying to restore the budget to something that resembles something humane.
Absolutely.
But you have also said, and I appreciate your positive perspective on this, that with a deficit of this size, we are actually right now in the best position we could be versus the past for dealing with this.
Without a doubt. See, this is very different than the big 09 recession. Thanks to ballot initiative and the voters, we both have to pass an on-time balanced budget by June 15th. We have to have the budget in print, and we also simply need a simple majority to pass it. So those structural changes really make the deliberative process very different than what we experienced in 09. The Pro Tem made it clear yesterday, and I echoed her comments, that we're also not going to make short-term decisions to get to a balanced budget that have long-term ramifications that harm people.
That is interesting you say that, because I remember a couple of the talking points from your press conference with the Pro Tem yesterday, where you challenged yourself as state leaders to be responsible and don't become part of the problem.
Absolutely. People need government when, the bottom has fallen out of your household income and your family. And so that's when government must step up and step in to provide the support. We're the safety net for many of those programs. And so in the middle of a public health pandemic, we cannot afford to scale back our funding and support of health, social services, those life-sustaining government-funded programs. And so we're going to have to work very hard. And, we're going to close whatever the hole ends up being. We'll address it through spending of reserves. We'll talk about ways in which to increase revenue. We'll talk about ways in which we can defer costs. We've done it before. There are any number of tools in our toolkit that in the last recession we utilized. So deferral, shifting costs, some belt tightening, which is different than program cuts.
Right.
Let's be clear. And fundamentally relying on the federal government to step up in a meaningful way to continue to provide the kind of support we've already seen through the approval of the MCO tax, through the 75-25 federal match through FEMA for all of our COVID-related expenses thus far. And, the governor has signed on to a letter joining with governors from the western states asking the federal administration for $1 trillion bailout. We figured out what California's allocation would be if that were to come through. I know the governor is in constant communication with Speaker Pelosi. And so we feel confident that the federal government will continue to provide support and will continue to benefit from that based on our sheer population, our sheer numbers. All of those strategies, I think, will lead to our ability to pass a balanced budget that is also cognizant of the long-term ramifications this economic pandemic will have on the state's economy. So we're not going to punt. We're not going to kick the stone down the line for next budget year or the one after that. We'll be mindful of the long-term ramifications of this economic pandemic. and will do right by Californians.
Will this be a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery,
or
an
L-shape?
L-shape?
Yes.
Using this new alphabet metaphor we have.
Exactly. And therein lies the difference between, with the LAO, providing this $18 to $31 billion range in terms of what the hole is. And so the LAO also says, quite eloquently in this spring recess, that the duration and the depth of this recession and this pandemic will have direct impact on our state's health and economy. And so we have to figure out all of those algorithms to get it right.
On behalf of California, I am thankful that you are at the helm here in the Senate of this budget process. I love your confidence and your tenacity. It is inspiring, but I wanted to ask you, and I almost can know the answer to this, but I want to ask you anyway. Have you looked at your budget binders for 2020? Have you looked at the spreadsheets? Have you looked at yourself in the mirror and said, oh, Lord, why me, why now? Or have you said, you know what, actually, this is the perfect time for someone like me to be in charge of this process?
You know, that sounds too much like right. No, I haven't had that thought when I looked in the mirror, because when you recognize, I made the decision to run for office in 2008 because of the budget deficit.
Absolutely.
And
I don't want to project that insecurity on you, because I know that you do not think that way.
I ran into the collapsed state economy willfully, intentionally, because I knew it was important for someone to have my lens, my skill set, the community I reflect and represent at the table to talk about why certain decisions were reasonable and why certain decisions were not. That we can't balance the budget on the backs of people who need state government the most. That's unacceptable to me fundamentally. And that's the lens I entered here in 2010. That's the lens I used when I tried to navigate those early budgets that were still in deficit, that we were still levying cuts on Californians. That's the lens I've used as I've tried to bring resources back in Medi-Cal program, in CalWORKs to increase the cash benefit, to try to pull children out of deep poverty here in California, to try to put monies back into early care and education, because we know that child care keeps California working. That's the lens I've always used, and that's the lens I'll use as we sit at the table and try to collectively navigate this budget, knowing that this public health pandemic has catapulted California into an unanticipated recession of this magnitude, but we will be all right.
That is inspiring news that I want everybody to hear from the budget chair of the state Senate here in the state of California. Has California made the right decisions in where we're going with these next steps, this trial and error phase? We're making this experiment of doing our best to try to bring people back to a sense of normal, but not make the error of not paying attention to the data and the virus and putting people more in a vulnerable position physically and health-wise. There's been a lot of just merciless debate and anger about this issue. Is California making the right steps, doing the right thing with the way that we are bringing us back to a point of thriving and getting our economy moving again?
You know, I think it varies by region. And so the region I know is my home region of Los Angeles County. And so I don't live, work, and play in Yolo and some of the more rural counties who are having a different response and reaction. My public health director in LA County, Dr. Barbara Ferrer, who is brilliant in her leadership, I believe, and it's been my experience, announced that it's, from her perspective, that LA County needs to continue to have a safe-at-home policy for the next 3 months. The county made the decision to open the beaches with restrictions. And I think the governor's leadership in opening certain sectors, small, with appropriate social distancing, will create an opportunity where enterprise and business can begin to take a breath and come back, as well as recognizing that none of us can afford to enter fall with the second wave of this pandemic.
And that's encouraging to hear you say that, because a lot of these counties are trying to write their own end to the story here.
And the governor has said, this is the statewide policy. I will empower counties to make decisions based on their best interests within this framework. And so we're looking at how many deaths and if your positive tests are coming down. I think that's very important. I have to tell you, I couldn't be more proud and relieved to be a California resident.
Yes.
Because when I look at the direction and directionless coming from the federal, I shouldn't say the federal government, from the White House, I'm struck. And it reminds me that government matters, leadership matters, elections matter, and we should always think about who has the courage and the discipline and the capacity to lead us in both good times and bad.
To pivot off of that, I want to get your perspective on what is going on in this country. We are at such odds with our viewpoints, with our attitudes. We are a country that it's not even differences of opinion. We seem to all live in separate realities.
I agree.
So as a legislator here in the beautiful state of California, what's your perspective on that as you see this, like the rest of us, roll out every single day?
Well, I am proud to hail from and represent the 30th Senate District, a district that I think, based on now years of serving, polling, and hearing from my constituents, believe that I am pretty solidly aligned politically. So I'm thankful for that. And yet I serve here in the legislature and have served with legislators for many years, and I've sat on the floor and in committees and heard them share a perspective on a piece of legislation and share their opinion, and I'm often struck about how different their perspective sometimes is from mine. I remember asking a former colleague on the assembly floor, maybe my first year in the assembly, what was the source of her news? Because I was so struck that she had such a different perspective on the piece of legislation we were about to vote on that I just was having a hard time understanding how she could have come to that opinion. And I had to sit back and look around and realize that there are people, that California is a diverse state. And I was surrounded at that time by my seatmate was a high school English teacher. The member who sat behind me from Orange County had been a banker. The Central Valley member who sat behind me was a cattle rancher. We all bring our ordinary life experiences and our perspective and our lens to this policy-making body, and that's the way it should be. California is a diverse state. But I think that there are some fundamental issues that we all have to come together on, and addressing the realities of a public health pandemic of this magnitude certainly is one of them.
In addition, as we continue to address that issue, let's talk about an issue I know is near and dear to your heart, public safety and public justice, particularly in the midst of this pandemic. California officials have halted admissions into state prisons, correct me if I'm wrong on some of the details, and released, or at least plan to release, nonviolent inmates to help stem mass infections in the jails and the prison, which, despite all of that, seems to be happening anyway. So our prison population is declining by some degree, but some say it's what happens next in our judicial system that will make a difference, that could mean the difference between temporary relief for thousands and permanent relief for millions. Expanding and making permanent incarceration reductions, expanding reentry assistance to support safe releases, and any money that we may save in this process, let's put it back into communities so perhaps we can prevent further crime from happening and filling our jails again. I know this is near and dear to your heart. It's a novel idea. Can we make this permanent?
Well, I think that's what I meant when I stated earlier. It's not about recovery, but it's restructuring, redesign.
Yes.
How do we think differently about some of these large government systems? Some updates. I had the opportunity to have several conversations with Secretary Diaz, the secretary of the agency, and he's made clear the releases that have happened are people who were already queued up to be released. They were within 60 days of a parole date. And so there have been no mass releases due to COVID-19 concerns. They have simply released people who were already scheduled to be released a little early. He's also made it very clear that he doesn't intend to do mass releases based on COVID, that he feels that within Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, they have the capacity and space and personnel to allow for social distancing. He reported just last week to myself and several other senators that every inmate has access to masks and cleaning materials to keep themselves safe. He acknowledged that They are being cognizant of those they release to make sure that they have a place to be released to. Because my concern is, how do you expect a different outcome for someone who's been locked up to be released into this current economy? Who is going to be able to find a job? And so it feels like to me that in some instances we're setting people up for failure. And so they are being mindful. The policy will also change towards the end of this month. I can't remember the exact date, where he is going to begin the transfer process again. So people who are at county jails waiting for transfer, those transfers will happen. And so our question was, how do we do that safely? Those people must be tested before they leave county jail, even then be allowed to quarantine. And how do you set up quarantine areas in a state prison? And so while the halt had been what had taken place thus so far, that is changing and transfers will begin again. And so we're hoping and really pushing that they think that through and that they have a full plan to execute that will make sure that they are guaranteeing the safety and the health of corrections personnel and corrections residents.
We've talked so much about getting back to normal. I've shared some of this conversation with your other colleagues in the midst of this in the previous podcast episodes that we've had, and I keep thinking we're beating a dead horse talking about it, but it still comes up in the headlines. What is life going to be going back to normal? Are we going to see more transformative government? And I want to have your positivity and your optimism contagious to me here, if you'll pardon the expression, but I'm still cynical about what's going to happen next. I fear that we're going to come out of this even more divided, less capable, poorer than before. That government is going to still be, not directly California government at large is still going to be less inclined to invest in problems and the challenges that are going to come down the line. It's in our hands, but I still have this fear that we're going to drop it based on past history. Convince me otherwise, Senator Mitchell.
I think that people who view government as something distant to them have to feel differently as a result of this. There is no one that has not been touched by this pandemic. Whether you're a parent, whether you are a parent of a child who hasn't been in school since March and won't be going back to school till fall, whether your parents are still alive and you're helping to try to navigate managing your seniors and their safety, whether they're living independently or in skilled nursing facilities. There is no one, regardless of race, creed, color, sexual orientation, or income level, that hasn't been touched by this. And fundamentally understanding the role government is playing to impact all of our lives. From a negative perspective, government was able to shut down the economy. Government said, go home and stay home,
right.
And business had to shut down.
Right.
And so however you view that, you were impacted. And so I'm hoping that people will take those experiences to understand, gee, this government really can have impact on me, and maybe I should pay attention to who's engaged. Maybe I should step up and vote come November in this national election, recognizing how there were elected bodies all over this country and people serving in them that had a direct impact on nearly every aspect of my life. And so for those who haven't engaged civically in recent history, I hope this has been a wake-up call and that we have a new majority of woke people who will pay attention, show up in November, and cast votes that serve their individual and community and collective best interests. That core belief helps me get up every morning and come to work.
And that message is why I love having Senator Holly Mitchell on my podcast. It is great. It's great to see you. Thank you for sharing that. I covet your perspective and opinions on everything that we talk about here. Did we change the world here in one podcast?
Perhaps we will change one mind.
That's right.
And so I'm going to ask that you continue to social distance, wear your mask, wash your hands, and stay safe.
I will, and I encourage everyone else to. Thank you so much for being with us, State Senator Holly Mitchell. Good luck with all the work you're doing out there. Good luck with the budget this summer. It's great to have you back here again on Then There's California.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Then There's California is a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and great ideas and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brolte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, Gunjan Patel, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of Senator Holly Mitchell of Los Angeles, the chair of the State Senate Budget Committee, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Be kind, be generous, stay healthy and safe, everybody, And thanks for listening to Then There's California.